Viz22 here. Before we begin, be warned that this story is not for the faint of heart or the weak-stomached. There are some very disturbing scenes depicted throughout this story, the most gruesome being at the very beginning involving an infant. So if you are not one for this type of horror, that is alright. A new, tamer video will be coming soon. But for those who stick around after this warning and then complain to me about the video's content, I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, on to the story. "Just the cutest," my grandmother exclaimed in a bubbly tone as she booped the baby's nose. My aunt had just given birth, a baby boy. He squirmed around on the table, his back rubbing against the soft blanket. He swirled his tongue around, his eyes full of wonder as they darted around. My whole family loomed above him. My aunt, June, looked down at him with proud eyes. Her husband, my uncle, Luke, almost shed a tear. My grandma, Mary, had this smile on her face, almost devilish. My grandpa, Danny, right next to her, like two peas in a pod. My mother stood next to me, her hands on my shoulders, my father standing behind her. I watched uncomfortably as they rubbed their hands across all the baby's body, admiring his soft skin. My throat slowly started knotting up. I jumped in my seat, my eyes twitching as my grandma raised up a shining blade and swung it down into the child's face. My neck cranked at the feeling of blood splashing against my cheek. The knife went completely through its head. The tip of the blade pressed into the wooden table. My grandma pulled the knife out, blood dripping off. I looked around at everyone. They were drooling over its corpse. My grandma slowly slid her tongue against the blade, licking off a sliver of blood. She pulled her tongue back into her mouth, her eyes rolling into the back of her head. "Sweet youth," she moaned, a grin on her face. "Dig in," my aunt chirped. My family knocked into my shoulders, rushing towards the body. They raised their knives and began slicing off limbs. Blood squirted across the table as they dismembered arms, flesh and muscle stretching as it severed. I watched my grandma sink her teeth into the severed arm, blood trickling down her chin. She chewed slowly, savoring each bite. Her hair slowly began changing, the gray strands almost instantly changing to a grayish brown. Her wrinkly skin grew tighter and smoother. She looked like she had gone from 75 to 55. My grandpa tore a leg off, blood pouring down the table. He sunk his teeth into it like corn, pulling on strands of skin. And just like Grandma, his frizzy gray hair began to transform colors, reverting to grayish blonde, bald spots filled in with clumps of hair. His skin smoothed out. My mother and father didn't need very much, so they picked lightly. My mother reached over with a fork and picked one of the eyeballs, tucking it off of meaty strings. She observed the small, shiny eyeball and then plopped it in her mouth like a piece of gum. My father took the other eyeball, blood squirting out of the empty socket and dripping down the side of its face. My uncle reached over with his knife and opened the baby's mouth and yanked its tongue out of its mouth and began slicing it off with the knife. Blood filled its mouth and squirted down its neck as my uncle chewed on the tongue like fat from steak. They continued to pick it apart, taking any limb or organ that fulfilled their insatiable desire. They began to slice it open after taking most of the outside. They slid down its stomach and pried its corpse open. "These are the goods. Like a piñata," my aunt joked as they dug their hands around its organs. They pulled out stringy intestines, slurping on them like sausages, and my grandma went right for the gold, tearing out its small heart. She raised it above her mouth, tilting her head back. She clenched the heart tightly, blood pouring down her mouth and to the sides of her face. My family cheered her on, as if she were chugging a beer at a frat party. She juiced out every last drop, licking excess blood off her lips. She then devoured the rest of the heart until there was no more. My uncle bit off pieces of lung like a pork chop. I watched as my family ravaged the corpse, blood smearing everywhere. I began to think about my siblings. I knew I had 3 of them, but I only remember one. I only ever met one. I don't even remember his name. I just remember playing with him one day and he was gone the next. My train of thought broke when I noticed a head in front of me. My uncle dangled his head in front of me, soaked in blood. Between his fingertips, a small toe with a nail ripped off. I looked up at him, my eyes shaking. He had this soft, encouraging look on his face. It was disturbing. I couldn't push the words out. So my mother interjected. "Oh, please, she doesn't need that," she chuckled. "Be grateful for that one," my uncle said, dropping the toe in his mouth. By the time they were done, the body had been picked clean. The only things left were bones and pieces of meat to save for later. I eyed the carcass, and it looked like it was attacked by rabid dogs. I looked around at my family. My grandpa and grandma looked young enough to be parents, and my aunt and uncle could pass as my older siblings. "Maria, honey, why don't you go to bed?" my mother said quietly, kissing the top of my head. I stood up, leaving the table, as my family bantered. I walked upstairs, the old stairs creaking as my feet hit each one. I went to the bathroom, quickly sliding in and shutting the door behind me. I turned the light on, and the room illuminating. I looked at myself in the mirror, my big brown eyes staring back at me. I scraped off the dried blood that splashed on my tan skin. I felt like crying. Why did I feel like crying? I've seen it before. It doesn't really get any easier. I understand, but do I? There was no point in questioning it. It was just one of those things. I should be grateful that they didn't choose me, that my parents chose parenthood over youth. I left the bathroom. Walking back to my room, I slowed my pace down when I heard the faint sound of Granny breathing. I looked around the dark hallway. I looked at the door next to me. The sound was coming from behind it. And then I remembered. My great-grandma Lorraine. She's been on the brink of death since the 90s. They always intended to involve her in the feast every time, but they get selfish and end up barely giving her scraps. Being in old age for over a decade has crippled her. She sits in her room and never leaves. They bring up slices of skin and chunks of meat on a plate like a dog. I know they don't care about her, only about the bloodline. I entered my room and plopped onto my bed, my body sinking into the cold, soft mattress as I drifted off to sleep. I wake up suddenly, startled by the sound of arguing. I open my eyes slowly, my eyeballs feeling dry. I slowly sat up, still a bit dazed. I overheard a loud conversation. "It's not fucking working anymore," my grandpa exclaimed, his voice muffled to the floors. "Did she eat any at all?" my uncle asked. "Yes, and it didn't do anything," my grandpa answered. "Does it ever do anything?" my mom snarled. "Don't be fucking stupid. It's kept her barely alive for years. Why isn't it working?" His rage grew, followed by a bang against a table. "Calm down. Why didn't you save more?" my dad chimed in. "Why didn't you save more? Why didn't any of you save more?" he barked back. "Please just shut up. She's been alive for this long. She can go a little longer without," my aunt groaned. I knew they were talking about my great-grandma. I guess they got a little too selfish this time. She can't die. She's my mother, for Christ's sake," he shouted. "We'll figure something out," my mom suddenly interjected. They stayed silent for a moment, my ears wide open. "The girl," my grandma suddenly proposed. "What?" my grandpa asked, annoyed. "Maria, she's young enough. Good amount of meat on those bones," her creaky voice explained. My body went numb as the words flowed through my ears. They couldn't have been serious. No, we made a deal, my mom growled, her voice beginning to shake. We did it with the others. She'll understand. We're family. My grandma tried to convince her. Fuck that. She's family. My daughter, you fucking hag. Don't ever try that again. My mom attacked. I flinched at the sound of a smack that rang through the floorboards. We brought you into this family. You are where you are today because of us. My grandma hissed. There was silence for a moment. We did it with the others previously. This is just how it has to be, my uncle reassured her. I'm not doing this. Touch her and I'll fucking eat you instead, my mom declared, the sound of pounding footsteps following. We'll get her in a few hours. It'll have to be a bit of a surprise. She won't cooperate, my grandma planned. My heart dropped into my stomach. I needed to make a move, now. I threw my blanket off of myself and hopped out of bed. I stepped onto the floor, squinting my eyes after realizing I might have stomped too hard, praying it wasn't loud. No other noises followed, so I started throwing around ideas in my head. I tried to map out the layout of my house in my head. 6 family members looking for me. My brain scrambled when I heard the sounds of multiple footsteps. I quietly opened my door, sliding out of my room quickly. I observed the long hallway, and no one was in sight. My house is pretty much a mansion, a courtesy of my great-grandmother's fortune. I slowly walked down the hall, my socks sinking into the old carpet. I heard muffled whispers beneath the floor. My best bet would be to sneak down the stairs and bolt out the front door. I crept closer to the staircase, trying not to alert anybody of my presence. Suddenly, my aunt turned the corner as she reached the top step. I froze in place, my heart racing. She turned to look at me, silent for a moment. A grin grew on her face. Maria, there you are. Could you please come downstairs and help with the cleanup? Your poor Aunt June's back is taking a toll. She let out a try-hard giggle. I thought for a moment, trying to plan my next move. Then I realized, they don't know that I know. I straightened my posture, closing my widened eyes, but my guard was still up. Sure. Could I go to the bathroom quickly? I asked. Yeah, actually, could I come in with you quickly? Gotta grab some ibuprofen. She smiled, tilting her head to the side. Bitch. I nodded and walked over to the bathroom. She wouldn't walk next to me, only ominously behind me. I looked out of the corners of my eyes as I entered the bathroom. I'll grab it quickly and be out of your hair. She approached the medicine cabinet. Stupidly, I let my eyes off of her when I looked down at the toilet, noticing the creaking pipes. All of a sudden, I felt hands push me over with full force. I yelped as I slipped on the tile floor, trying to grab the toilet to regain balance. My hands slipped as well, and my forehead crashed into the side of the bathtub. The impact rippled through my head. Blood began to trickle down my face. I slowly opened my shaking eyes, my vision blurry. Just make this easy, she groaned as I felt her kneel behind me. She balled a clump of hair in her fist and pulled my head back. I looked up, blood sliding past my eye. Just a sliver, and some more. Her mouth stretched into a sinister smile as I saw a knife go towards my arm. Still dizzy from the hit, I used all my strength I had and swung my elbow, knocking into her nose. She fell off of me, on her knees, leaning over the tub next to me. I stood up, almost falling backwards. I blinked tightly a few times, trying to clear my vision. I looked down, and she was covering her nose with her 2 hands, the knife on the floor next to her. It was too risky. She released her hands, placing them on the lining of the tub to help her get up. Before she could lift herself up, I raised my leg and dropped my foot on top of her head. Her head crashed down, her mouth ricocheting against the lining. A knocked-out tooth sliding into the tub. I quickly whipped around and dashed out of the room. I ran for my life down the hallway, finding any room to run into. "You little cunt! Danny!" Her cries echoed out from the bathroom. I continued to run, my feet stomping, then halted harshly, almost leaving tire marks, when I hit a dead end, the only door left on this side of the floor. I looked behind me, waiting for a furious ant to come for blood. I heard quick footsteps run up the stairs. "Oh my God, what happened?" my uncle asked. I turned back around and barged into the room. I shut it behind me quietly, trying not to give away my location. I looked around the room and it was pitch black. I dragged my hands across the walls to feel for the light switch, and when I flipped the switch under my fingers, I flipped out. The room illuminated. I was in one of the dozens of living rooms, couches you weren't allowed to sit on, tables you'd get crucified for if you set a drink down on them. The room painted a light maroon, the fancy sofas a bright pink. I looked around for any windows to escape, but they were all too small to escape through. I quickly noticed the two medieval armor statues that stood like guards together at the back of the room. I walked towards them, feeling like they were going to get possessed and leap at me like in Scooby-Doo. The light reflected off of their shining silver armor, their hands clasped together, holding long swords like canes. I kneeled down, dragging my finger down the side of the blade. I raised my finger up, noticing blood coming from a paper-cut-sized incision. They're real. I noticed the blood from my head dripping off my chin. I wiped the stream of blood that ran down my face, smearing it on the back of my hand. I stood up and looked behind me at the door. I haven't heard a sound since I escaped my aunt. I looked back at the statue. Suddenly, a light bulb lit up above my head. I grabbed the statue's fingers. They were easily adjustable. I pulled them back one by one until I stepped aside as the sword dropped to the floor. I grabbed the handle with two hands and tried to lift it. "Jesus Christ," I groaned as the sword had an unexpected weight. I felt my face turn red as I tried to lift it above my head, but my arms gave out and I had to drop it to the floor. I panted as I tried to catch my breath. I could lift it at least up to my stomach. I realized how loud the sword was when I heard footsteps quickly approaching the room. My eyes widened as I began dragging the sword over to the door. I quickly ran over and turned off the lights, planting myself in front of the door, lifting up the sword and holding it like a spear. I aimed the tip towards the entryway, waiting for someone to walk. The footsteps grew closer, the pounding shaking the floor. I tightened my grip, my arms shaking, my gaze locked. The footsteps reached the doorknob slowly turning. The door flew open, light outlining the silhouette of a man standing in the hallway. "Where the fuck are?" my uncle called out. I put all of my might into it, cutting off his words as I rammed the sword through his stomach. He let out a drop of air as it escaped his lungs. His mouth dropped open. I slowly trekked closer to him, pushing against his weight as I impaled the sword deeper into him. Blood began trickling out of his mouth. A look of fear glimmered in his eyes. I pushed the sword far enough that the base of the handle prevented me from pushing any further. He looked down at me, the life leaving his eyes. He tried lifting his hand, his skin losing color. He reached for my neck, lifting his other hand as well, and before he could get a hold of me, he collapsed to the ground, the sword still inside of him. I looked down at his corpse, my chest pumping, a pool of blood forming under him. I couldn't believe I had just done that, but it oddly didn't feel bad. "No!" a voice cried out from down the hallway. I looked down the hallway. My aunt stood, a knife in her hand. Her light brown hair was frizzy, looking like a bird's nest. I could see a broken heart in her eyes as she watched me standing over her husband's body. The heartbreak quickly transitions to rage. Her jaw was shaking with anger, her mouth covered in dried blood. She slowly raised up the knife, looking bloodthirsty. I stared her back down, trying not to show fear when I was really just frozen. She broke into a sprint, letting out an ear-piercing cry as she flew down the hallway. My fight or flight kicked in, and before she could reach me, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I jumped back as the knife pierced through the door. "You little shit! I'll fucking gut you!" she screamed from behind the door, retracting the knife and stabbing it back through. I looked around for something to defend myself. I didn't have enough time or strength to grab the other sword. My time was cut off when she began kicking the door. I slowly stepped back, eyes still on the door, trying to back up as far as possible. I could tell adrenaline was running through her veins when the door gave in after 3 kicks. The door swung open, the knob crashing into the wall. She stood in the doorway, her upper body moving up and down. She was breathing like a beast. I walked around the sofas, standing behind the small glass coffee table. She began walking after me quickly. I sidestepped quickly, trying to run her in a circle around the sofas. With no defense, she caught up to me quickly, grabbing my hair before I could turn around and making a run for it. I screamed as she threw me backwards, dropping me onto the glass. The thin glass instantly shattered behind me, my back pressed against hundreds of shards. Before I could try and get myself up, she pounced on top of me like an animal. Our gazes crossed, her eyes lit with fire. "I'll savor this one," she hissed through her teeth, raising the knife up high. Her knees pressed into my stomach. I struggled to reach for a piece of glass. I stretched my arm out, but couldn't get a grip on a big piece. She swung down, my impulse reaction being to raise my hand up. I blocked the knife with my hand, the blade going through my palm. The blade pierced entirely through, the handle pressing against the wound. Not able to squeeze out a scream, the shock numbing the pain. I watched as blood trickled into my face. I quickly snatched a big chunk of glass and jabbed it into the side of her neck. The look of anger on her face dropped as blood squirted into my hand. Using all of my strength, I gripped the shard tightly and dragged it across her neck, blood pouring out as I left a rigid gash that ran across the entire front of her neck. When I reached the other side of her neck, I ripped the shard out, leaving a wound deep enough to hit her windpipe. A long cut imprinted from the glass pressed against my hand. She fell over, gargling blood in her mouth, slowly stood up, tripping on shards of glass. I looked down at her body, the youth slowly leaving her. Strands of gray hair grew back, small wrinkles forming on her skin. The pain finally hit me as I looked at my hand, the knife still stabbed through. I took a deep breath and held it as I tightly gripped the handle. I slowly pulled the knife out, the sound of metal grinding against flesh and bone. "Fuck!" I shrieked in pain as I took the knife out, tears streaming down my cheeks as I lifted up my shaking hands, blood streaming down my arms as I observed the massive hole the knife left. I had no time to cry as I heard footsteps running upstairs. They had heard my scream. I quickly ran out of the room, keeping the knife as a weapon, and down the hallway. I needed to get out of the house. Before I could turn the corner, someone quickly grabbed my hand and snatched me inside of a dark closet. I squirmed around, punching and kicking everywhere, swinging the knife around. "Who is this? I'll fucking kill you!" I threatened as I twisted and turned. Suddenly, hands grabbed my shoulders, trying to get me to stop wriggling. "Shh, it's me," my mother whispered reassuringly. I stopped moving at the reassuring sound of her voice. "Oh, thank God. Everyone's going fucking insane. I've literally killed Uncle Danny and Aunt June. Oh my God, I killed them." I panicked, the situation truly setting in. "It's okay. You did what you had to do." Another voice reassured me. I realized my father was in here as well. "What are you guys doing in here?" I asked quietly. "I'm assuming you know the plan. I stormed away up here. Your father and I talked in here for privacy. When we heard the fighting, we stayed out of fear," she explained. "What do we do?" I begged for a plan. I don't know," "There's no way to make it downstairs," she added on. "I just want to get out of here," I quietly sobbed. My father stayed silent for a moment. Sounded like he was choked up. "I'm sorry. I love you. But it's for the family," he suddenly declared. "What?" I questioned confusedly. "Don't do this," my mother pleaded breathlessly. What's going on?" I began to panic. "She's in here," my father called out. My whole body sank. I felt like I was spiraling in a dream. He threw the door open and shoved me out in the hallway, dropping the knife inside of the closet. I stumbled around, falling against the wall. The sound of running came from downstairs, sounding like bulls. I regained balance and began running back to the room where my aunt and uncle laid to rest. "Stop!" my father called out to me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my entire body shaking. I slowly turned around, my cheeks soaked with tears. My father stood at the other end of the hallway, a rifle in hand, aimed at me. I froze like a deer in headlights. He kept his aim steady, his eye looking to aim. "Please, don't do this," I begged through my tears. As he was about to pull the trigger, my mother came out from the closet and lunged at him. She leaped out of the closet, slicing his waist with a knife. I jumped where I stood as the bullet just missed me, hitting the door frame behind me. He turned to my mother, a look of fury painted his face. "You stupid whore," he roared, hitting her with the stock of the rifle. She cried as she fell to the ground, blood dripping onto the carpet. He swung it up, hitting his chin and knocking her on her back. He stood over her, holding the rifle with two hands, and began bashing it into his face. No, stop," I cried out, barely able to get the words out. I watched with empty lungs as he repeatedly bashed her face in. Her nose snapped to the side, eventually caving into her face. Blood splattered across the floor, her eyeball beginning to pop out. The sight was nauseating, but I had no time to mourn. I tried running down the hall and past him, but he put a hold on bashing her face in and swung the rifle into the back of my head as I flew past him. I groaned as I tumbled to the ground, my face burning as my skin rubbed against the carpet. I felt his pounding footsteps coming towards me. I took a chance at making a hit and kicked my foot back. My timing was perfect, and my foot rammed into his ankle. "Fuck!" he groaned in frustration, and before he could stand up, I grabbed the gun from his hands and knocked him on the top of the head with it. He fell to his knees, his hands planted on the ground, blood trickling through his dark hair. I stood in front of him, the rifle in my hands. I lifted his chin up with the barrel of the rifle, looking at him in the eye. The fire in his eyes had been blown out. He looked scared now. I crammed the barrel into his mouth. He gurgled as the cold metal filled his mouth. I tilted the gun down, aiming the barrel up. He looked up at me with pleading eyes, but I barely gave it any thought as I pulled the trigger. The bullet burst through the top of his head. Blood and brain matter flew through the air. I flinched as blood and chunks hit my face. I retracted the gun, and he fell over, the hole in his head pouring blood onto the carpet. "What have you done?" a voice cried out from the end of the hallway. I looked up. My grandpa stood at the end of the hallway, his hand gripped tightly on a hay hook, presumably from our barn. He looked around, observing my body count, a look of horror on his face. He came storming down the hall, quickly stopping in his tracks when I raised up the rifle. I aimed him down, keeping him where he stood. I pulled the trigger, but the gun only clicked. I looked down at the gun in confusion and pulled the trigger again. It clicked. It was out of bullets. I looked up at him, and he laughed at me. He began walking towards me again. I dropped the gun, looking around me with the mere seconds I had to find something else to defend myself. The knife was nowhere to be found. I thought my mother may have fallen on top of it, but I didn't have time to move her body. I swiftly ran into the closet, grabbing anything I could find in the darkness. My hand grazed across a wooden baseball bat. I snatched it quickly, until the jarring sensation of a blade dug into my shoulder. He had swung the hook into my skin, leaving me screaming in agony as he pressed his foot against my back. Pulling the hook in deeper, he yanked it back, knocking a windless scream out of me and dragging me back into the hallway. I tried to keep my grip on the baseball bat, but it slipped out and plopped right outside the door frame. I wriggled as he dragged me out, the hook feeling like it was about to tear right through my skin. He dropped me, blood soaking through my shirt. He vigorously ripped the hook out from my skin, earning another agonizing scream from me. I placed my hand over the oozing wound, squinting my tear-filled eyes. He raised his arm up, ready to gouge my eyes out. I swiftly rolled over, just missing his attack. The hook pierced through the carpet and into the wooden floor. He groaned as he struggled with pulling it out, as it got caught on strings from the torn carpet. I stood up wobbly, growing dizzy from the blood loss. I stumbled over to the closet and grabbed the baseball bat. I lifted it up, swirled it in the air, and aimed it down, building up a good enough swing. Before he could get the hook out, he looked up at me. I swung the bat up, slamming it into his chin. He stood up, his legs moving like jelly. His back slammed against the wall. I had caved his jaw in. Teeth fell out, along with a waterfall of blood. The crunchy sound of broken bones as he tried to open his mouth. The youth was slowly leaving him. Wrinkles grew quickly. Strands of hair growing from blonde to gray, patches of hair retracting into his scalp and forming bald spots. He looked like a grandpa again. I lowered the blood-soaked bat again and hit him with another uppercut, his head splitting off his body. Jumping up with his spine attached to it like a toy, his head slid back down into his neck, and he stumbled around, blood circling down his entire neck. He collapsed to the ground, blood pouring everywhere. I stood over him, my heart and lungs on fire. I couldn't believe I had just done that. He broke like porcelain. I dropped the bat with tired hands and looked for the knife. It was an easier and more lethal weapon. I approached my mother's corpse. Her bloody face caved in. I wiped a tear that came quickly. She saved me. The only family member who wasn't trying to eat me. I rolled her body over, weakened from all the wounds. The knife was hidden under her body. I grabbed it and stumbled down the hallway. I flew down the steps, tripping on a few of them. I limped towards the front door, the feeling of escape so close. I grabbed the cold metal handle. I took a deep breath, trying to keep myself conscious, and I turned the knob and cracked open the door. The sweet taste of freedom turned sour as I felt a sharp pain in my upper arm. I began to scream, my shout growing louder as the pain grew stronger. I looked over. My grandma was sinking her teeth into my arm, her eyes rolling into the back of her head, my arm spazzing from the pain, my grip on the knife loosening and dropping it to the ground. She collected a clump of bloody flesh in her mouth and began to pull on it, my skin and muscle stretching like gum. I fell to my knees, screaming until my throat practically bled. She pulled farther until my skin gave out and broke off. She chewed on the chunk of meat, swirling it around in her mouth like a piece of steak. She threw her head back, moaning in pleasure as she fed off my youth. Her hair grew longer, the gray strands vanishing, and her skin looking baby soft. She reached her peak age once again. She cackled devilishly as I looked down in horror at the gushing wound she left. I swiftly grabbed the knife off the ground and sliced her ankle. "You little bitch," she exclaimed in pain. I tried to open the door and run away as far as I could, but I was too slow. She wrapped her hand around my neck, dragging me back and choke-slamming me to the ground, the knife slipping out of my hands, sliding just out of reach. She sat on top of me, wrapping both hands around my neck. She slowly squeezed tighter and tighter, completely blocking my windpipe. Tears in my eyes filled to the brim as I felt the blood trapped in my head. I coughed up saliva as I wriggled around to break free. She stared down at me, flashing her teeth with a ferocious smile as she awaited my demise. She leaned in closer. "I love watching the life fade out of the young, like draining blood from a chicken," she sniggered as I slowly began to black out. I made one last attempt at survival before she crushed my windpipe. I stretched my hand out, my fingers about to detach as I reached for the knife. I grazed the handle of the knife with my fingertips. It was so close. The energy in my arm grew weaker as my neck tightened in her clutch. Right before my life began flashing before my eyes, I got a decent grip of the knife. She began opening her mouth wide, ready to bite down on my face and feast. Before she could, I lifted up the knife with every bit of life left in me and shoved the blade into her mouth. Blood immediately began pouring out of her throat and onto my face. Her grip slowly began to let go, my throat clearing up space to breathe. I took in as many breaths as I could as I slowly pushed the knife deeper. She choked up blood, squirting it onto my face as I pierced the knife through the back of her throat. I twisted the knife around, the blade grinding against her teeth. She fell over, her grip entirely loosened. I took in a breath so deep it could have popped my lungs. I could feel the blood flowing back through my body. I coughed up a bit of bloody saliva. I looked over at her corpse. Her hair had turned a frail silver again, and her skin wrinkly and baggy. I did it. I survived. Everyone. I disorientedly stood up, the sudden movement too much for my body to handle. I approached the door. The coolness of the handle soothed my hand. But before I could leave, I remembered I had forgotten something. I leaned down and pulled the knife out from my grandmother's throat, blood spurting out from her throat and across the tan wooden floor. I limped upstairs, walked down the hall. I looked at the bodies as I passed them. When I reached the room, I could hear my great-grandmother's dying breaths. I slowly opened the door, the light from the hall peering into the dark room. My great-grandma sat in a wheelchair, one they never cared to let her move around in. I approached her with a stare. You would have thought she was dead if her lungs weren't pumping. She didn't look at me. I didn't think she even knew I was there. I tilted my head, just staring at her as she slowly breathed with a deep wheeze. It was a strangely peaceful connection, for a moment. But all good things come to an end. I cranked my arm back and swung the knife into the side of her head. The blade went straight through, the tip of it pointing out the other side of her face. She didn't look any different than when she was alive. Blood trickled down the side of her face as she slumped over in her chair. I stayed silent, watching her corpse lie. I stood and thought to myself for a moment. Fuck this family.